Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third session today on the future of work. Thank you all for joining us today. A short disclaimer before we get started. The information presented here is for the purpose of informing the board. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or any board member. We are recording today's session. We will be able to access it on our website at ssab.gov. Questions and comments are welcomed and encouraged and can be submitted through the Zoom Q&A function, or you can email us at events@ssab.gov. You can also tweet us using our handle at @ssabgov. Feedback is also welcome and can be sent by email to events@ssab.gov. My name is Emily Rossell. I'm a senior policy researcher here at the Social Security Advisory Board, and I'll be moderating this panel. The objective of this event is to hear perspectives from a range of experts focusing on mortality, disability, and work, and discuss the implications of current knowledge to inform future trust fund assumptions. This panel will discuss expectations around the changing nature of work and why it is particularly uncertain. People qualify for OASI and DI by contributing to the Social Security trust funds through taxes on their earnings from covered jobs. What work will look like is critical to understanding program contributions and costs. I'll start off by introducing our panelists. Then SSA's Office of the Chief Actuary will give a brief presentation, setting the stage for today's discussion. Each panelist will then give opening remarks, followed by a moderated discussion with the actuaries and our panelists. Just a reminder that full bios for our panelists are posted on SSAB's website. Stephen Goss has been the Chief Actuary at SSA since 2001. He has worked in areas related to health insurance and long-term care insurance, as well as pension, disability, and survivor protection. Karen Glenn is the Deputy Chief Actuary for Long-Range Actuarial Estimates at SSA. She is responsible for the demographic and economic assumptions that underlie the 75-year estimates of the cost of the Social Security program, as well as for the long-range cost estimates of Social Security. Stepica Mudrazea is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Systems and Population Health at the University of Washington and a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. He studies issues related to population aging, intergenerational support, and the health and well-being of older adults in the U.S. and internationally. Stephen Popper is a senior economist at the Rand Corporation and professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. He currently works on decision-making under deep uncertainty, science and technology policy, and security planning. Shelley Stewart serves as director of the Future of Work Initiative, a part of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. She has studied the changing nature of work for more than 10 years and is an expert on non-standard work arrangements and the gig economy. Now I'll turn it over to Steve and Karen for their presentation.
Thank you, Emily. Let me start on the next slide, if I may, and then Karen and I will go back and forth a little bit on this. And thank you so much for setting this up, Emily, and the rest of the folks from the SSAB. And by the way, I'm hoping that everybody here on the panel and elsewhere were on for the couple of earlier sessions that we had earlier today. There was much discussion in the last session about disability that really relates very directly to the nature of work. A lot of discussion of workplace accommodation and many other aspects about the changing age distribution and other aspects of our population. So if we can flip to the next slide. Thank you very much. This is something that we've been looking at for some time now, partly in the realm of disability consideration, but also just in terms of looking at work in general. As Emily well described, being employed, working, having earnings, and having payroll taxes paid on them is the basis for people being insured for Social Security benefits and determining the level of the benefits. And then when they're not working, that's when the benefits kick in. So employment is really everything. Now, what we have here is some material from BLS showing over the period of the last 20 years, the changing distribution of workers by occupation. And it's really quite striking. We've had a big increase in the number of people in management, professional occupations. And we've been relatively flat or even declining in most of the other areas. Service has been going up somewhat, but in a lot of the areas like natural resources, construction, et cetera, some of the sort of higher risk physical jobs, they've actually been flat to even possibly declining in some cases. So the changing distribution of employment certainly speaks to sort of the nature of the work in the context that we're interested for the purpose of Social Security. Where are the jobs? Where are people employed? And the question is this a new level, or are we going to continue moving in these directions? That's one of the questions we have. So on the next slide, please. This is not quite as directly related, but just to give you an other interesting sense that relates to this, the shift in the men versus women composition of our workforce of employment. And you can see here the first two bars in each of these segments will show you the difference from going from 1970 to 1990. And you can see for men the employment rates, that is the ratio of employment to population for the particular age segment indicated, typically declined at some ages more than others for men. But for women, there was a dramatic increase in employment rates between 1970 and 1990. At some of the older ages, maybe not until a little bit later. So we've had a dramatic shift by gender, by sex in the population for our workforce. And that has probably contributed to some degree for what we saw on the first slide. So what we're really interested in here for so very, very many reasons is the changing nature of work, not just in terms of the types of jobs, but also one other thing I would throw in that we talked about a bit on the prior panel is the changing age distribution of our population with fewer people at ages, say, 25 to 64 compared to the entire adult population. Well, that put extra demand for workers in the traditional ages and to higher ages yet. And with that, let me pass the baton to Karen, because I think Karen has some answers.
Thanks, Steve. We could move on to the next slide. Great. This is just a different way of looking at that employment data, sort of a different cut at it. Each line you see on these graphs is for a different age group. Going from 1990 to 2022, you'll see the panel for men on the left and women on the right. Age group 25 to 54, so that broad age group is at the top. And you can see that each successive age group has a lower employment population ratio. A few things to note on these graphs. You can see the large drop off for most age groups following the 2007 to 09 recession, and then the very gradual rise back. Also, you can see very clearly the effects of the 2020 recession following the pandemic. There you see a very quick recovery in contrast to the prior recession. More broadly, over time, you can see that age groups 60 to 64, 65 to 69, and 70 and older have all been increasing. And this relates somewhat back to our disability discussion this morning. How much of this shift is due to the changing demands on workers, accommodations by employers? And as the age distribution of the population continues to change, and we've got more people at those older ages, will these trends continue? Next slide, please. This one focuses on the quits rate. So the quits rate, many of you are probably familiar with, is a measure of how many employees voluntarily leave their jobs. And on this graph, the quits rate is the dashed red line, and the blue line is the employment population ratio. This is all workers, all people age 16 and older. And again, these rates are age sex adjusted. You can see that the quits rate really tracked the E to pop ratio very well up until we got to the pandemic. After that, things changed. So in general, a high quits rate means there's an increased demand for workers, which is what we've been seeing recently. The question we've got is, will this relationship settle back to its old pattern, or is this really the new normal? Will there be a deviation between the two rates? Next slide, please. This turns to a couple of graphs we just put together recently and was mentioned in the previous panel. This is employment by disability status. So one thing to note, first of all, All of this data is based on self-reported disability status as reported in the current population survey. So it is not the same as the definition we use for Social Security disability benefits. So just keep that in mind. The top graph here shows a few stats through time. First, the blue line near the bottom shows the percent who are self-reporting as disabled. And as you can see, since 2008 until the present, that's been really stable. Maybe a very slight tick up in the past couple of years, but it's really been at around 7 to 8% for all that time. The yellow line shows the unemployment rate for the same group, those who self-report as disabled. Obviously, the pandemic spike jumps out in early 2020. The really most interesting thing to take away from this graph, though, is the gray and the orange lines. The gray is labor force participation, and the orange line is the employment to population ratio we've shown you in some previous graphs. Both of these lines have been trending up noticeably since about 2013, and even more so in the last couple of years. So clearly something is going on so that people who believe themselves to be disabled are working more. The bottom graph, this is folks who do not report themselves as disabled. And you can clearly see that there's no similar rise in employment over those same years. So questions we've got for the future. Will those employment rates for the disabled population continue to increase? Will they level out or something else? And with that, let me turn it back to Steve.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And on our last little slide, we just have a couple of the questions that we're wrestling with. Karen alluded to at least a couple of those I might have earlier also. One is there's much talk about AI, and we're also going to have further automation in many, many areas, robotics, et cetera, et cetera. This diminished the need and demand for human beings to actually be working. We note, of course, that mechanization of farming way back when, industrialization did not. We seem to always find a place where human beings can still engage and contribute productively. And when do we not want more production so we can have more consumption? A second point is, will we continue to move towards having jobs be less physically demanding and less dangerous, thus allowing workers to work longer and to older ages? Effective infrastructure, immigration, climate change may all have something to say about this, but these are trends which have been going on for a while now, as we've seen from the graphs Karen was showing on the prior slide. And where are we going in the future? Part of this really is, again, a matter of the changing age distribution of our population. Will there be an increasing demand for people at higher ages to work longer, first of all, because they can, second of all, because of the changing nature of work, and also because of relatively fewer people at young age as compared to 20 or 30 years ago. And finally, even if we have automation and AI, we'll still require human production, many maintenance and design for the foreseeable future for these entities, in all likelihood. Automated work, even no matter how much that is, we're still going to have ways in which people will contribute and people will be required for that. We've seen the Industrial Revolution in the past. A lot of people thought, well, perhaps we won't have need for human beings to work. Didn't work out that way. So the real question is, with all of these factors, what should we be expecting in terms of employment rates in the future? So much looking forward to all of your thoughts on this. They will be much appreciated.
Thank you, Steve and Karen. Now I'll turn it over to Stipsa for your opening remarks.
Thank you. I hope you can all clearly hear me. As it was said in the introduction, I'm assistant professor in the Department of Health Systems and Population Health at the University of Washington and non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. And my research focuses on broadly studying the economic well-being of older adults, and obviously labor force trends at older ages are an important element of it. So in particular, in a recent study that I did with my colleague from the Urban Institute, Barb Butrika, we explored the relationship between the evolving nature of work and health, work-related disability, and disability applications through its impact on job demands. And in this research, we used data from the Health and Retirement Study alongside information from the Occupational Requirements Survey and the Occupational Information Network. So first, I'll talk briefly about some of the findings from this research and then try to link them more clearly with the main takeaways in the context of our discussion today. So we found that job requirements, in particular as they relate to work flexibility and physical demands, are an important determinant of disability applications, even accounting for various personal characteristics. And our findings suggest that Americans are increasingly working in jobs that require more education, experience, and training, but also offer more workplace flexibility, whereas environmental conditions and especially physical requirements of jobs are arguably becoming less challenging, at least on average. The relationship between health status and disability applications partially varies by job demands, and that relationship is also changing over time. So, for example, the positive relationship that we find between having multiple doctor-diagnosed health conditions and disability applications is attenuated as job flexibility increases and then gets amplified as physical job requirements increase. Importantly, those that are applying for and receiving DI benefits come from an increasingly select group of workers that are facing worsening job conditions and increasing work requirements. Furthermore, we found that changes over time in job demands are driven primarily by within occupation changes, meaning that the same jobs have higher requirements today than they had in the past, especially with respect to cognitive demands of jobs. So it's not only, as we heard previously, that the composition of jobs and where people work, what types of jobs is changing over time, but also the nature of jobs themselves, nominally the same jobs, is also changing even more so over time. So in the context of what we are discussing today, what are some of the main takeaways? Well, first, the changing nature of work means that an increasing share of older adults may be able to work longer if they want or need to, given that both the composition of jobs in the economy and the job demands within occupations are changing toward being both physically and environmentally less challenging. However, there are several caveats. First, as cognitive demands of jobs are increasing and dementia is increasingly recognized to be among the key health challenges facing older adults, this raises the possibility that those experiencing cognitive decline, think of mild cognitive impairment, which is sort of a first step toward becoming cognitively impaired during what are traditionally considered work years. Think of people in their 50s, in their early to mid 60s, they would face constraints in their ability to remain attached to the labor force. Also, an increasingly select group of less educated older adults is still working in physically demanding jobs, and they're disproportionately applying for and relying on disability benefits. Therefore, while the overall trends may indeed favor increased labor force attachment engagement of older adults, there are important segments of older population that could find it hard to remain in the labor force at older ages. This is important in as much, quote unquote, simple solutions such as increasing the retirement age across the board obviously are never that simple and can really work for all only if designed in such way not to penalize those older adults who, through no fault of their own, simply cannot continue working beyond a certain point in their lives. Now, while I do consider that the results that I was just talking about may have some relevance in the context of thinking about the future of work, they are to some extent incomplete as they primarily focus on the supply of jobs in the economy and supply of older adult workers, but fail to recognize the importance of hiring process and any possible barriers that older workers may face in it. And in fact, in another study that I did with Barb Butrika, we focused on examining skills-based hiring process and trends for older adults. And we found that older adults do continue to face age bias in hiring, often motivated by long-held beliefs that older adults are unwilling to or incapable of adopting IT skills needed for job performance, that they are less flexible than younger workers, and that they may be comparatively too expensive. However, while these stereotypes persist, we also found that there are positive signs of employers increasingly valuing the experience, job-specific skills, and work ethic of older workers. Interestingly, increasing appreciation of older workers seems to coincide with a general aging of the workforce, including managers making hiring decisions. So flexibilization of work and increasing availability of part-time and remote work, which were already underway, further accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also there has been a general shift toward more of skills-based hiring. And this seems to be an overall positive for labor market prospects of older adults. But again, those benefiting most from these trends are experienced professionals. So there's a little bit of that, again, that story of bifurcation where there are increased opportunities for some, but then also a group that is still being, so to say, left behind. And so just a couple of concluding thoughts. I would like to say that, speaking more generally, the change is permanent and inevitable in all human endeavors, including in how we perform work. So in that context, we need to be ready to embrace it rather than fight it. Indeed, the changes that we are already witnessing or about to witness in the coming years are something that, while inevitably bringing disruption, could also provide enormous opportunities for improving the well-being of older adults and society more broadly. So to put it simply, in a world where human capital, I think we would all agree, is increasingly scarce, there is really no justification for wasting any of it. So I will stop here, and I want to thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stepika. And next, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. Look, I have no particular expertise on the future of work. The people joining me on this panel have much greater insight into this than I possess, but the remarks I want to leave you with certainly are appropriate for a day devoted to discussing the uncertainties surrounding the future of work, as well as the future of mortality and disability, the core issues of OASDI. The task of the Social Security Administration is not that of engineers building a bridge. SSA and its analysts need to account for and respond in much greater degree to the presence of uncertainty. Not all uncertainties are created equal. For some, we can use probabilities to account for possible vagaries in future conditions. Many of the uncertainties that SSA deals with are demographic. How many 65-year-olds will there be in the United States 20 years from now? Well, that's uncertain. Small changes can bring large changes, large effects over time. But we know that those who reach that age in that year are currently alive today. How many will take the 65-year-old or 66-year-old payout when they reach that age? Well, that's a bit more problematic, and why we're interested in the future of work. The Social Security problem is an example of a larger class of problems, those requiring analysis of policies that play out over the long term. And this can bring in yet another form of uncertainty, what has come to be called deep uncertainty. Deep uncertainty exists when we cannot adequately characterize uncertainties by probabilities because, well, those turn out largely to be just another category of conflicting assumptions. Deep uncertainty exists when we do not know or we cannot agree upon the probabilities attaching to future values of important factors, or we do not know or agree upon what are the causal mechanisms that lead to different outcomes, or call it deep controversy. We do not agree on the normative basis for assessing future outcomes. How much economic growth do we want versus environmental sustainability? So the presence of deep uncertainty takes analysis designed to support policy planning and decision-making out of the realm of the predictive analytics, or at least it ought to. The paradigm of engaging in the best forecasting that money and analysis can provide, and then optimizing a decision around one or a group of forecasts, leaves the resulting decisions all too brittle and subject to surprise. Yet, if law or regulatory practice requires this predict then act process to occur, it leaves the analysts with little choice in the matter, and policy planners, on the other hand, are left underserved. What I and my colleagues have learned in taking on policy problems characterized by deep uncertainty is that we should take the same models and the same data that already exist within agencies such as the Social Security Administration and ask a different set of questions. Today, we ask of data and models and analysts the question, what is likely to happen? What will be the future of work? But is that even really the right question? The question that we would truly like to have answered is, given that we cannot reliably predict what will happen, how can we best choose among available short-term actions so that they will be consistent with long-term goals across many potential futures? And I would submit that this question really lurks behind most requests for forecasts. So why not address it explicitly? Analysts face difficulty in providing definitive forecasts to policymakers as the time horizon lengthens. There's also often a quiet disconnect in meshing the styles and requirements for rigorous analysis with the needs and language of legislators and decision makers. How can the deductive logic of analysts best support the more inductive logic, the logic implicit in what-if conjectures and narratives that are used to plan and implement policies? Over the past 20 years and more, a widening group of policy analysts have developed and applied a series of methods designed to support decision-making under deep uncertainty. The methods share certain attributes that should be of interest to the leadership of SSA and those charged with conducting analyses in its support. I'll just run through these very briefly. The purpose of analysis is shifted from the current project of determining which set of currently unknowable assumptions is likely the more accurate. Rather, the analytical resources are used to search for, assess, compare, and stress alternative solutions, alternative policies over a range of assumptions. And an important result is that the policy body itself is brought into the analysis in the very terms used in the policy discussions, which relieves the burden on policy planners for themselves deciphering what importance analytical results might hold for their deliberations. Conducting an analysis with a broad range of plausible assumptions from the onset goes quite a way towards deconfliction over interests, viewpoints, and equities. All are along for the ride. It's no longer that one needs to be wary of the initial assumptions that will then drive the final results. And rather than being forced to determine ex ante what scenarios are important for understanding choices, DMDU methods instead derive and illustrate important scenarios analytically. By important, I mean an important scenario is one that helps illuminate policy choices, their potential consequences, and the key factors that should be used in selecting among them. Another common feature of these methods is that uncertainties are not characterized in terms of probabilities that often we can only weakly guess at, and the import of which is difficult to translate into policy narratives. Rather, the uncertainties are characterized in terms of the effect that they have on the choices before us and on the criteria upon which decisions should be made. And by the way, one discovers that not all uncertainties carry the same weight. I mean, to be sure, they all may have an effect on outcomes, but in DMDU methodology, we've gotten out of the prediction game. Instead, we're trying to compare choices. And routinely, we discover that only a few unknowns really are crucial for decisions on policy choice. In other words, you can answer the question, what would I need to believe is or will be true in order to recommend policy A over policy B? And finally, the adaptive approach to planning that emerges from this style of analysis should not be understood as being open-ended planning. Robustness is achieved by determining which short-term actions are assessed as being of low regret, identifying in advance signal indicators as guides to how the future may unfold, as well as what are alternative courses that would be taken in light of what is observed at these points. So let me close by really kind of telling you why I wanted to take this opportunity to discuss this. We're at a point of transition. The challenges faced by our institutions of decision-making mean that they are no longer best served by past approaches and processes. The capacity exists for this style of analytical decision support that I described, and that I would suggest is better suited to the complexity of the challenges being faced by the institutions of democratic governance. Well, this is not necessarily the way things are done in Washington. There is something of an unfortunate cycle of policy planners and decision makers asking for only those analyses that they believe are feasible and reasonable to ask for, or are in accord with existing law and regulation, And analysts are then forced to conform to the narrow questions being asked of them. I would hope that we could perhaps take a step back and consider what the means we now have available could do to resolve some of the fundamental questions that lead to the sessions that we have had today. And with that, I'll thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Now I'll turn it over to Shelley.
Thank you all so much. And in some ways, I think I'll build off of some of these ideas around deep uncertainty and hopefully provide at least a few more answers than additional questions. I'm Shelley Stewart, she, her pronouns, and I currently direct the Future of Work initiative at the Aspen Institute's Economic Opportunities Program. And first of all, thanks so much for the opportunity to engage in this conversation and be here today. And I'm kind of generally considered an expert on the gig economy, platform-based work, and how those types of arrangements reflect and impact broader labor market challenges. But my own research within the discipline of sociology started much more broadly. And I'm actually going to start there today in order to try to explain kind of how we got to this point where the gig economy is a regular part of conversations, especially conversations about the future of work. And you know, I engage in a lot of these conversations about the future of work, given my current title and position. And what I see as the defining trend of the labor market and the direction that we're headed is not about app-based gig work. It's not about automation displacing workers. It's not about generative AI and ChatGPT reshaping different types of work. It's about a shift of risk. And that's been going on for about half a century as the risks of labor, of work, increasingly fall on individuals, on workers in a wide range of industries going about their jobs. And I push back a bit against describing this as kind of the changing nature of work, because that can, come across as kind of this intrinsic aspect of the work itself, but it's really the changing nature of work relations. It's not intrinsic, it's not technologically driven, although new technologies do facilitate it in various ways. It's more the result of shifting norms of business practice and of decision-making, both within business and within policy, where labor and work is seen less as kind of the driver of the economy, the source of profit, and more as kind of an expense to be cut by the business in the name of the bottom line. And this manifests itself in several different ways. And one of them is that it makes it harder to make trends. And this is where this intersects with a lot of what Stephen was describing. In this world where risks are increasingly borne by individuals, people's careers are up to them. So rather than a system of long-term employment being rewarded with pension plans, our economy is set up to incentivize job switching, to maximize income over the career in order to build wealth as an individual, which takes on that risk and also prompts people to move around. We also see a rise in contracted work arrangements, which take a wide range of forms across a really wide range of industries. So we may hear about this most commonly in terms of app-based independent contract driving. This is your Uber, your Lyft, your DoorDash. We see it in the rise of non-tenured adjunct teaching at universities in relation to tenured professorships. We see it in the way that physicians shape their contracts with hospitals. So this is not just among lower wage sectors. We see it at the gym as personal trainers take on individual clients rather than being employees of the gym. Somewhat ironically, HR work can now be contracted out. So rather than hiring an HR person or department, small and mid-sized businesses can contract that out to a different company that manages the HR functions of a whole wide range of different companies. And there's a lot of different implications to these trends, but one to start with is how hard it makes it to project into the future, so long as this is happening, because it puts a lot of the decision-making about work and about labor in the hands of the workforce, rather than in the hands of employers. And employers tend, this is a generalization, but they're more likely to act predictably, to follow trends consistently, to kind of play by the rules of economics, at least to some degree. Where the workforce itself, the people who make up the workforce, are much more diverse, have a much broader set of goals and of priorities. And so the overall trend of shifting risk is pretty well documented. It makes predictions as to what that means and kind of how it shapes our future even harder. So questions like, if people are going to work, how people are going to work, how long people will work, when that's shaped by individual incentives and decisions and positions, it gets harder and harder to predict that as change becomes more and more likely. So with that kind of said as the foundation, we can think a bit about what are some of the implications that we do understand. What is this so-called gig economy, and how does it impact how we think about work and workers going into the next few decades? And with this term gig economy come a whole range of definitional challenges. So for some, it means specifically the app-based work, the Uber driving, the DoorDash delivering. And for others, it's kind of anything falling outside of a long-term, permanent, full-time employment arrangement. And kind of somewhere in the middle is a pretty broadly used definition, which is the one that I'll be generally referring to, which is work that falls outside of full-time, long-term, direct hire employment. It's not a great definition because it is an everything but sort of thing. It encompasses a wide range of things outside of that one kind of normative paradigm of what work can look like, to include a whole basket of other things. So, the term has grown in its use with the rise of app-based and task-based work. This again is the Uber and Lyft driving, but it includes independent contracting, freelancing, short-term work, seasonal work, project-based work. By sector, it's a lot of arts and cultural work. It's almost all domestic and care work. And these jobs have existed as long as work has. In fact, much of it predates what is considered to be this traditional paradigm of work. But it's an othered type of work because policy and measurement have been built around that traditional paradigm through the middle of the last century, looking to what workers, which is predominantly white male workers, were doing. It is employment with a firm over a long-term direct hire work. And that's how we tend to measure work, and that's how we tend to design policy, and our programs are still designed for those types of work. And so when we think about how many people are really engaged in gig or non-standard work, the measurement is tricky because of that reason, because of how our tools were designed. Most reliable, valid measures, these are the ones used by Census, used by BLS, were designed around that work and do not always reflect gig type work arrangements. We see that reflected in kind of wildly conflicting estimates. You'll see numbers from, no one is doing this, it's less than 1%, to everyone is doing this, it's going to be 2/3 of the workforce by 2050. And a lot of those differences are also rooted in the different definitions that people are using. So we have these kind of two competing factors, or two coexisting factors, that explain why in some ways we don't have a great idea of the wide range of ways that people are working. That all said, taking into consideration those challenges, when the different measures are standardized, when definitions are kind of evened out as much as possible, about 10% of the workforce relies on these different types of non-standard work as a primary income source, so as their main job, and an additional 10 to 20%, although this number is fuzziest of them all, use it to supplement another income source, most commonly a more traditional job. And that piece, that very uncertain portion of the workforce that is using gig work as a supplemental job, is kind of the focus, or where I want to bring the most attention today. Again, unsurprisingly, and a common theme, there's tensions with multiple job holding data as well. Current population survey shows some decline, but that definition is generally considered to be particularly likely to miss gig work because of the time frame used for that. And gig work is often taken on pretty sporadically. So if you're asking people what they did last week, it's highly likely to miss whatever gig work they may take on over the course of a month, much less 6 months or a year. If you look at census longitudinal employer household dynamics data, there has been an increase in multiple job holding. Again, that is likely to miss a lot of the gig work. But that over the last 20 years has shown an increase from about 6.8% to 7.8%. Not a huge gain, but still a noticeable increase. And looking at tax return data, there's even a steeper increase of people earning secondary income from a second job. And that is especially independent contracting work, and most especially the biggest increase in the major app companies that we commonly think of. And so when we think of supplemental work, there's a piece of this that is kind of cultural. That's a trend towards how can we monetize our time. I'm not going to have knitting as a hobby. I'm going to knit hats and sell them on Etsy. And that is a piece of what's going on here, but there's a much bigger issue that is financial necessity. When wages have not kept up with the cost of living, especially major expenses of housing and education and medical care, one job is not enough to stay afloat for a lot of people, and retirement savings as people get older are not enough to live on. And we see the biggest increases in this type of work, and this is on some private surveys, but especially the tax data again. The biggest increases are among populations that do not fit into that traditional work paradigm, which at the time, systems were designed were primarily mid-adulthood white men, and continue to be so. But we see increases among older workers who may not wish or not be able to work full-time, but don't have enough savings or retirement income. So they pick up gig work to supplement that. We see it among workers who are balancing caretaking commitments, whether that's of children or parents or themselves, and who are unable to take on the rigidity of many traditional employment schedules. We see it among workers locked out of employment systems due to former incarceration or lacking a stable address, and among people across all demographics for whom today's low-wage, low-agency jobs just aren't enough. And the opportunity to work for a lot of these people is welcome, and the broader labor market could learn from the relatively low barriers of entry, but it also introduces a kind of gray area of work, which is work that exists because other systems are failing. So we often hear about the changing nature of work as it relates to the gig economy as a rise of gig type arrangements, and less about sort of the why behind that. And so the conversation needs to address the whole picture and not just look at gig work existing in isolation, but as part of an entire trend, again, back to the shifting of risk, and the stagnation of wages in relation to both productivity profits and cost of living. So it's not, a trend in isolation or an inevitable reality, but it is something very real that we need to be thinking about and grappling with. But we can't just look at gig work we need to think more broadly what's happening in the labor market that is driving people to this, and how can changes to the labor market overall potentially change the way that we're thinking about and projecting reliance on gig work as well. So I will stop there and look forward to some conversation.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you to all of our panelists for those wonderful presentations. First, I'd like to turn back to Steve and Karen and see if you have any reactions or questions for the panelists based on what we just heard.
Thank you, Emily. Let me offer a couple. First of all, talk about a wide diversity of breadth of thought here. This is really just exactly what we were hoping for in this kind of a panel. Let me just react to one thing that Stephen Popper mentioned, which is deep uncertainty. The good news is that the charge for our trustees that we in the office actually work on for providing the annual trustees reports has a very simple ask. It is, what is the actual status of this program? It's nothing terribly specific. And as a result, we are able to take into account anything and everything related to deep uncertainty. And that is, of course, why our friends with the SSAB staff have helped us put together this discussion with you all today. We are not really dealing with the narrow questions. We're trying to get a good overall sense of what's happening with the society and the economy going forward to help us in assessing where we will be under current law, Social Security, and what the implications might be for other changes. Now, Stipika, thank you so much for sharing about sort of your sense of sort of where we're going with capacities of people having into the future, the kinds of changes in what is being demanded in work. We have seen tremendous increase in educational status of the population over time, many more people, which does fit. Now, whether that's a driver of or just as accommodating the changing occupations towards more needing education, less physical, not entirely clear, but we certainly have gone in that direction. So it's positive to see that we're going to be there and likely probably staying there in the future. Shelley, you're talking about the shifting of risk. I have to share with you, and I know you all are very well aware of this. One of the places we as actuaries first saw that was in pension plans provided by employers who were hiring people for a lifetime of work, when they shifted away from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, expressly with the notion of de-risking, which is really, as you well put it, it's shifting of risk. We've also been very conscious for a long time now, people working in the self-employment sector, that based on the best data we have available, a shrinking share of work in independent contractor self-employment actually is being reported to the government for tax purposes. And the sad part about that is, if it's not reported and people aren't paying payroll taxes, they will not be getting credit towards Social Security benefits. And so what is their plan then for where they're going to be in the future? The other thing about the gig work, something I think we've all been much exposed to, it does not appear to be all just a matter of people having a regular job and then having a gig work as a side hustle, as some people like to put it. But rather, in many cases, it's something where people has, as I think you were alluding, Shelley, 2 or 3 gig work jobs, which part of the de-risking by the employers is, if you're working less than a certain number of hours, then benefits may not be forthcoming. And so this presents with us a whole set of uncertainties of people in the future not having employer provided help when they reach into retirement. But at least, hopefully, if all this gig work is in fact reported, payroll taxes are paid on it to Social Security, at least they'll have coverage for the combination of all that work in the future, which is really what we're looking at. So just an immense breadth of uncertainties. And if you all could be a little more specific on telling us exactly what you think the path is, most likely the median, Stephen, what do you think? It's we know that uncertainty is huge. By the way, let me just mention, in our projection models, we do not just have deterministic best estimate, although that is what is most cited. We also have sensitivity analyses for changing one parameter at a time. We have a stochastic projections, which show a dramatic range in all aspects. And also our basic projection isn't just the intermediate. We also have a high cost and low cost. So we're very well aware of variation, but I will have to share with you, and I see Amy coming on camera, and she knows it well, having worked on the Hill, that ultimately policymakers in the Congress they generally do have a simple question. What's your best guess? We'll act on that. So we always try to keep attuned to the uncertainties, but thank you all for raising all that. Karen, did you have some further points you would like to raise before we get to Amy, Nancy, and others?
No, nothing at the moment. I will be interested. I would like to hear from the board members first. I would be interested in hearing a little more from Stephen, because I think what you're saying is you just think we should be approaching this a completely different way. Like the framework of what we're doing just should be approached completely differently. And I think I have not quite wrapped my head around that yet. So I do want to understand that a little bit better before we end. And maybe Emily, maybe now is the right time to ask that question.
Yes,
now that I
Stephen,
put it out there.
do you want to weigh in now? Oh, Stephen, you're on mute.
Stephen, you're still
I think
muted.
you're still on mute.
Okay, sorry. I've got, I did something when I was looking at the questions that didn't allow me to come back. Yeah, I'd like to address a couple of points that Steve raised. And, you know, I appreciate the nature of the work that is done. I mean, as I've expressed previously, I mean, the quality of the analysis is superb, and you know, the quality of the analysts, you know, is justly renowned. So, you know, the problem is not that, you know, people are doing things wrong. The problem is sort of pointed to by a couple of the things that you said, Steve, which is, you know, you are essentially asked a relatively simple question that can be answered a number of different ways, but it's constrained by, you know, being consistent with current law, where we will be under current law. And you also mentioned doing sensitivity analyses, which is, you know, as we understand, is certainly best practice for the type of analyses that I've characterized somewhat crudely as predict then act. The problem with both is that it leaves you looking at a relatively small point, or if you do sensitivity analyses, a sphere, a relatively small sphere in the larger uncertainty space of plausible futures. And it leaves unexplored all the rest of that space. You got the point estimate or point estimate with sensitivity analyses, and it doesn't describe a space in which the principal business of Washington can occur, that being politics. What's the trade space within which analysis suggests that you could change things like COLA rates or FICA rates or general fund revenue transfers or other changes in policy, and still be within that space that the analysis suggests means that you would be consistent with your long-term objectives. So in an analysis of the type that I describe, and I hope this helps out to some extent, Karen, might be to look at those parameters of policy that I just described. Look at the range of where you think the policy debate is over COLA or you know, maximum salary level subject to FICA or whatever, and tell the computer in which you have placed the exact same model that you work with or a series of models. Show me 20,000 different policy portfolios that take different points along these policy dimensions. Just choose them randomly using some kind of a uniform sampling process And now let's compete those policies across a range of alternative futures described by the range of assumptions over things like retirement rates and the sort of things that Shelley was describing, the demographic and work behavior and so on. And let's see which of those policy portfolios seem to be successful according to this range of criteria that we have set, that ultimately would be set by policy. And now let's look and see which one of them seem to be more routinely successful, or what elements of those packages look like they would be more routinely successful. And now let's kind of put together a different, let's call it the proposed policy package. And now let's throw everything but the kitchen sink at it. Let's explore the full range of assumptions and uncertainties and understand what are the scenarios that would be stressful for that set of policy packages. Anyways, I won't go on in any greater detail. The point is, to do a greater examination not only of assumption space, but of policy space. And that's, I think, at the point where the people who sign your paycheck might get a little bit nervous.
So, Stephen, let me just offer very quickly. I think I have some very good news for you.
Yeah.
While we in the Office of the Actuary and also our trustees do not and are not charged with putting forth what we think would be the best policies for making change, we have 535 other people in the DC area whose job is exactly that.
Right.
They come forth with ideas all the time. And if you want to look a little pitch here, if you want to go to ssa.gov/OACT, look under provisions, you will see somewhere on the more than 100 provisions that have been put forth covering the broad range you just described of different kinds of policy changes, whether it be retirement age, to what level should we be paying taxes, what should the COLA be, covers all of these areas with estimates of where that would take us. And all of those estimates could be applied relative to not only the intermediate projections, but also if you think we would be in a different space on any of the assumptions. The only other thing I would suggest here is that we are not in the business of prediction or forecasting. We never refer to our projections as that. All of our projections are purely on the basis, and I know, Nancy and Amy and everybody else on the board are well aware of this. They're all projections under a specific set of assumptions, which are laid out very, very clearly. And that's why we have a range of different scenarios that we haven't provided. But if you're looking for policy alternatives and what they might do, please visit our website. You'll see a bunch of them, all generated by our members of Congress that we've developed estimates for.
The only quick rejoinder I would, and I welcome that. And the last time I looked seriously at SSA policy analytics was 15 years ago. So everything that you say is good news. The only thing that I would offer in response is that, it's the simple models that drive policy discussions. FDR was a genius at creating the simple model that would put in people's heads different pictures. And the simple model that is used now is, the Social Security Trust Fund is going bust, in 2033. And what I'm suggesting is that, it would be useful to provide, and I'm not saying that this is anything you guys have not figured out already. It would be useful to provide those 535 individuals with a relatively simple explanation of, here is the available trade space. Have all the politicking you want, but anything outside of that space, and we cannot be as comfortable in telling you that you will be consistent with the long-term goals that you have expressed, at any rate.
And so let me just ask you this.
Steve, can I just,
go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off. I just want to make sure the board members get a chance to jump in with their questions. I know
Great.
Amy has a question, so Amy, if you want to go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Stephen. Really an interesting discussion here. I wanted to shift our conversation a little bit, recognizing that this event is really thinking about technical assumptions. And certainly there are lots of ways to do forecasting, projections, whatever we want to call it. But I saw in the chat that Hillary Waldron asked what I thought was a really interesting question. And so I wanted to pose it during my time. And so I'm just going to read it verbatim here. How does the panel think the nature of the Great Recession and pandemic recession affected the labor market and its composition in those years? Should we think of a time series in those years as representative in a 75-year framework, or alternatively, should we adjust for a big financial shock recession and a pandemic shock recession? And if so, how? And maybe, since it's such a big question, maybe Steve, if you want to start by just sharing how you all have dealt with this in the past, because certainly you in your data have the Great Recession already in there for the trustees' reports.
And Amy, are you referring to me, Steve?
Yes,
Okay.
you, Steve, is the expert on all things trustees' reports.
Well, hardly that. No, we have multiple Steves, very common name in our baby names lists. But you know, with respect to the Great Recession, one of the things, I mean, Karen showed so nicely in some of our slides that while it took a decade to recover in the employment sector from the Great Recession, it took less than a year really to basically fully recover, interestingly, from the 2020 recession. So the resilience of the economy is not a certainty. We have to be careful in our modeling to assume that if we develop a model based on experience over one period of time, things will always be the same in the future. I'm not sure if exactly, I wish Hillary were here with us right now so she can restate for herself. But if what we're talking about is the idea, have we outlined the economic cycle? No. There will be economic cycles in the future, and that will have implications. What the implications of each and every economic cycle have on us is not clear. The 2020 so-called recession was coupled, of course, with a pandemic. And so we had a combined effect of those. And that's what I think really that Stipika was talking a lot about, and many other people today, about the changing nature of work becoming more virtual as we are doing today. And I guess the big question is, how much will that stick in the future?
That's super helpful.
Will we revert?
I think part of what the question was asking was about how the workforce composition was different during those time periods. Do we know that in the data at this point?
Well, we do a little bit. If we look at it in terms of the very first slide we had, we were showing the change in the distribution of employment by occupation. We can see how that has been happening over the last 20 years. And I think what we have seen, particularly in recessions, is that we have a temporary, I mean, obviously in the pandemic, we lost a lot of people from employment temporarily in the service sector. People weren't going to restaurants, but it appears as though that is coming back. We also lost a lot of people, it seems, from some service areas working for, shall we say, consumption item distribution, as in Amazon. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but we've seen really sort of a change. Are people going as much to big box stores as now having things delivered? And the question is that temporary, or are we going back? And this, I think, really speaks a lot to what Shelley was talking about the changing nature of work, like the gig economy. Is this a one-way street? Is it going to be ever more so? Or is this really more like a sine wave going back and forth? And I wish we had good answers on that.
That's really helpful. And I'm glad you mentioned Shelley. Shelley, would you mind chiming in here?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen from the pandemic in terms of gig work, and I would say enough time has not gone by to see really what the impacts have been, is that there was a pretty sharp increase towards the start of the pandemic. And this is, it's logical when you think about it. Huge numbers of service sector people were not able to work. A lot of people were turning to apps to get food delivered. Those people stepped into those jobs. And what's happened since is it's spiked and came down, but it is still higher than pre-pandemic levels. And it's, still too soon to know if that will continue to decline, but if long-term trends tell us anything, it's sort of a jump up that will persist.
If I can jump in on Shelley, on that point. And it really picks up something Steve just said. And that is definitely, I'm so glad you've brought up risk share. And it definitely is a very long trend starting in the 70s. But the question is, will it continue or will there be a pendulum swing and or a sine wave, as Steve put it? And I think what's missing in some of parts of this discussion is government. We had, before the risk shift, we had government, we first of all had an employment system where families got their health insurance, their retirement security, and so forth through work. And then in the 30s, we had minimum wage, maximum hours. We had unemployment insurance and so forth. And as we had increasing regulation, ERISA came just as that shift was going, and that was part of what put the nail in the coffin of defined benefit plans and shifted the risk that way because of all the employer fiduciary responsibilities and so forth. And a lot of the gig economy, a piece of that, of course, are the change from W-2 workers to independent contractors and getting out from a lot of those regulations. There, as you know, there are a number of lawsuits that have been brought to talk about misclassification, but beyond that, there's talk in both the states and in Congress of requiring this mislabeling, or even if it's correctly labeled, putting more requirements on those who've been are treated as independent contractors. If we got even an expanded Medicare, lowering the age to 55 versus even Medicare for all, that would make a huge impact on employment and people's employment opportunities. So much of wages now go to paying non-cash, so forth. So this is sort of a long way of saying Congress is taking note of some of what's going on. I mean, there is a lot of talk about the shift to independent or mislabeling of independent contractors, talk about expanding Social Security, talk about expanding Medicare. And that may, I guess the question is, will that reverse some of this trend, or you think it's just, it's a railroad going down the track and it's just going to keep going down? So that's sort of whole range, government's role and government's changing policy and what impact that has on all the issues we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in to say that it was government action and especially inaction that has got us to where we are and could just as easily stop and reverse that trend. I think whether or not that will happen is anyone's guess. I think there's definitely potential. This is in no way inevitable. And I think I mentioned it's also not driven by the technology. It's driven by decisions made by people in positions of power, both in government and in business.
Well, it is the deep uncertainty with what Congress will do.
Bob here. I was going to jump in on this and pick up on what you said, Shelley, because it seems to me in Steve Popper's suggestion that we sort of open up all questions and look across the board. It ultimately comes down to policy. And right now we're having this enormous policy debate in this nation about what the role of government should be and what the role of the whole system should be. And I'll just emphasize, I just go immediately to the idea that right now we have a system in place, and then we have efforts to underfund the system operation so that it can not work at peak efficiency, is the way that I would put it. So what we have now embodies this tension. And by the same token, I know in listening to you, Shelley, as a student of history, I don't think of this as a new phenomenon in terms of how workers are treated. I think of it as a return to an old relationship between workers and employers. And so I think of it as a broader cyclical thing that is driven by policy and ultimately by the voters. So I know the work that Steve's office does works within a template, it seems to me, of a system that was put in place. And opening up a broad range of assumptions seems to me to be, I know we've got AI now and very powerful computers, and maybe maybe we'll be able to develop analyses that go far beyond what we can do right now, but I don't see how we do that. So I guess I'm questioning how we can really throw all those assumptions open and hope to arrive at something that we would all agree is workable. Okay.
If I could offer one small thing there relative to what you just said about Stephen, one thing we have found over all the years is that there's been some resistance, and I mean, Amy and maybe some others could speak to this, some resistance in Congress from having sort of automatic adjustments on things, like automatic adjustment on the retirement age for what's going to happen with there's more of a desire to say, no, we want to specify this in law. And to the credit of members of Congress, when we've talked to them about this, they said, if it doesn't work out, we can always change it. And that is so true. A law is nothing but a statement of intent by that Congress, and the next Congress can change it. So nothing is absolutely set in stone. Amy, please go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate the call out, Steve, and certainly plenty to discuss here. Though, as I'm thinking about the point you're making, wanted to circle back to a question around, what does this all mean? Because ultimately, you all need to take the information that we're getting here and put it towards the assumptions going forward. So I'm curious just how this panel thinks how the nature of work might evolve to encourage people to work at older ages. Because we talked about mortality this morning and how a lot of some folks are living longer, though there's some changes in the composition there. So would love to hear from our panelists about how they think, especially Shelley with the gig economy, if that's something that might allow for older ages.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a few ways to think about this question. And one is the necessity piece. And gig type jobs are available to almost anyone. And if you do not have enough income to live on, regardless of age, that becomes a very viable option. There's another side that is about accessibility and kind of allowing access for people who do want to work and for whom a more traditional arrangement may not be appropriate or feasible. So there's, the gig economy provides both. And because it can be available, it also should not need to be used by folks for whom it's the only option.
So Pizza, I wanted to see if you have anything to add there too, because I know your work focuses on employment at older ages.
Yeah, so I mean, and before doing that, if I can just go back to earlier discussion, we talked about recessions, right? And Great Recession and pandemic and what impact it has on the long-term impacts. And I would say that often what happens with recessions is that they accelerate already existing trends. And so flexibilization of jobs, the availability, to work remotely, etc., it already was on the rise, facilitated by technology that was being developed. It just got turbocharged during the pandemic because of the need. Now, to what extent that may get scaled back, that's a question. I mean, we see examples, we see companies like, I believe it's Goldman Sachs, that is trying to get people back 5 days in the office. We see others that are going a different route, and especially tech companies letting their workers to be fully remote. Urban Institute, for example, they also allow people to be fully remote now, whereas before pandemic, people were allowed to be, up to 2 days per week. So some things got accelerated, and I think that's generally a feature of many recessions, that things that were already underway get accelerated, as opposed to really making this dramatic change of reverting back to something that was decades ago. That usually doesn't happen, right? So I think it while we don't know, each recession is unique. It happens for different reasons. Those black swans are called black swans for a reason. While we don't know that, we may have some sense of how things may play out based on what caused the recession, and then that can give us some input for assumptions that would be built into the projections. Going to also in terms of the labor, part of it is how much employers need people with certain skills, and that ultimately affects the negotiating power. And it's not a new phenomenon, that's been there forever. And we've seen recently also a little bit of a resurgence, maybe it's here to say, maybe not, of organized labor. And so between those trends, there may be changes in the future. And in that regard, I think, especially with respect to projections, and the future of work, I think it's inseparable from immigration, because of the importance of immigration for this economy, and thinking about what is happening globally. And globally, basically, you have an increasing number of countries with declining fertility. The pools of really qualified labor are being exhausted. So any kind of assumption that would think of immigration as something that can be switched on and off is sort of fool's errand, because there simply is a decreasing number of available people in the world that could fill the ranks of the types of immigrants that the economy would potentially need, which then impacts, what I was talking about, the negotiating power of workers vis-a-vis employers. And so those kinds of things, I think we can talk about some level of certainty. We see those trends to be, pretty inevitable, at least over the next several decades. And so I think those are some of the things that could feature importantly, right? And then, Amy, can you remind me of, we were talking about the question you had specifically?
Yes. So the question I asked was around how the nature of work was evolving and might encourage people to continue to work at older ages. And so Shelley was able to share a little bit about the gig economy.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we've seen is generally that the types of work requirements for different jobs have been changing, both within occupations, and then there's a compositional change. And so basically jobs are becoming increasingly cognitively demanding. But generally speaking, the physical demands on the jobs are becoming less prevalent. And those types of adjustments generally favor the ability of older people to remain longer in the workforce. Now, that can also that has to be looked in conjunction with health trends for older adults, because it's not only about the requirements of jobs, but it's also about how the health picture of older adults looks like, and that's where the issues regarding cognitive health may become more relatively more important than issues of physical health, which used to be the dominant, and now there's a little bit more of a balance of the importance of physical and cognitive health for the ability of older adults to remain attached to the labor force.
Thank you. Jagadish, I wanted to see if you have any questions for the panelists.
Well, I don't know if I have any questions. I do have some observations. I don't know if maybe I'll be short. This session was on the future of work, but a complementary session should be on the future of pay as well, because you might work a lot of hours, but if you don't earn a whole lot during those hours, then this still has implications for the size of the payroll tax base going into the future. And that has a lot, the salient issue there is the labor share of output and the adoption of labor saving versus labor augmenting technologies in general. That's a whole different discussion, but we need to get to the bottom of that as well if we're going to talk about projecting the payroll tax base, which is ultimately what matters. That's my first observation. The second observation is someone mentioned that the job flexibility and more supply of jobs, especially gig work and so on, better accommodations by employers in jobs are good, but they have differential effects across workers of different types. Much of the benefit may be accruing to educated workers who can work longer, have desk jobs rather than physically demanding jobs and so on. But my observation would be that the disparities in how these different amenities in jobs affect different types of workers occur not just across education, but across many other different attributes. And in the morning session, there was some resistance expressed in terms of how disaggregated our modeling must be in terms of not just the incidence of different health outcomes, but also different sources of disability, but on the types of people that are exposed to the risks of those alternative health outcomes and disabilities. So I would still make a pitch for a more disaggregated set of projections, which will then add up to the baseline projection that the actuaries make. And there does not seem to be any, in principle, any objection that could be levied against a micro-founded set of projections that would help inform the trustees and policymakers in general. And a final observation is that we are talking about, employers de-risking and engaging in more contract work into the future. A single observation that I would say is now over the last, 50 years or so, we've seen government expand all sorts of social protections, food security, SSI, disability insurance, health insurance, pensions, and so on and so forth, which have served to de-risk for workers, because they now have all these sources of support to fall back on, which may then trigger their preference for more flexible work, because they now have the source of fundamental source of a social safety net to fall back on if things should go wrong, and they periodically might go right. So workers' preference for flexibility may be one thing underlying the reason we're seeing more people engage in gig type work. And the point that you have to fall back on this work and take 2 or 3 gig jobs in order to make ends meet. Well, the other side of the coin is, thank God the jobs are there, and that happened because of technological progress and adoption and better information technology that makes these communications channels possible, so that we can have Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and types of work possible in the economy, which helps people make ends meet. So there are, the meta message here seems to be that government action to reduce the amount to de-risk for workers has been met by employer reactions to increase risk on workers. So the total amount of risk that workers face may not have declined in the end. You can poke a balloon on one end and it pops, it inflates further on the other end, is the kind of thing that I see. So people talking about the pendulum shifting back and forth. I think the pendulum is here to stay as long as we have a pretty robust social safety net into the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know we're just about out of time. I just wanted to quickly see if any panelists have any final thoughts they want to add before we wrap up.
I can maybe take a minute to respond quickly to what I understood Chairman Judef to be asking about, introducing more exploration of policy alternatives and so on. I mean, what I suppose I've been advocating is a technological innovation, or at least an innovation in technique, but I'm by no means a technocrat in two senses. Policy should not be decided by computers. The job of people like me is to support those who make policy and to help them better understand their choices, the consequences of those choices, and the basis upon which to choose among them. But also, in a second sense, I by the nature of the work I do, I engage in a lot of technology transfer, methodological transfer, and so on. And what I've learned is that the technical aspects are at best, 50% of the job. You have to be aware of the process, you have to be aware of the sensitivities, you have to be aware of the organization, and so on. And I guess my bottom line suggestion is that there are ways and means to perhaps gradually introduce this sort of perspective that I have been suggesting, rather than throwing a bomb in the midst of the existing policy process in Washington. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Stephen. Shelley or Stepizza, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I'm not sure if I have really, super insightful final thoughts, but I would say on the, from the existing evidence, that we can say that in terms of older adults, we can say that their future is potentially bright. Obviously, there are always issues that can, we don't know what the future holds in terms of unexpected events, but from some reasonable assumptions, we can say that we are going toward the world, I think, where an increasing number of older adults will have the opportunity to work if they wish so. Now, that's different from those who might be forced to work because they have to. And that's where, we just need to be careful in how we approach the two groups and who are in two groups, and also then the third group of those who may wish to continue working or would need to continue working but cannot because of the health issues. And I think it's important to distinguish those groups and approach them in terms of the policy making in such way to make it fair in terms of the outcomes that they would face and supports that they would be getting. But on a broader point, I just want to say that obviously, talking about any individual aspect is almost impossible without having this broader view of all the trends that are happening simultaneously, and that's why I really commend you for that approach in your work, and I think that is ultimately the way forward, is to really have this all-encompassing view of demographic trends, of health trends, etc., and then those impacting things such as the future of work, and none of these pieces can be looked at in isolation from all other things that are happening simultaneously. And I think that you have that view, and I think it's important, and it allows for a reasonably useful predictions to be made that policymakers can rely on with all the caveats attached to them.
Great, thank you. Shelley, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Recognizing the time, I'll just say, I think we've raised a lot of the very key essential questions about the future of work. And there's a lot of answers that I think we'll all be continuing to work on.
Great, well, thank you so much for all of our panelists and to everyone joining us today. I think this was a really interesting discussion. And I'd like to turn it over to Bob for a few final words.
Thanks very much. And I especially want to thank our audience for engaging with us today and participating in this quite thought-provoking and challenging conversation. Feedback is welcome and desired. And if you would like to comment on today's event, please email us at events@ssab.gov. That's events@ssab.gov. And with that, one more thanks to everyone, and our day is complete. Thank you.